Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're jumping into the world of Ireland's public finances, looking specifically at the situation towards the end of 2024.
That's right. And our guide for this deep dive is a recent Fiscal Assessment Report from December 2024. It's a really insightful piece of analysis, actually.
Yeah, because from the outside, Ireland's economy looks incredibly robust, right? You see these headlines about surpluses, record employment. I mean, what's the catch?
Exactly. And the mission of this report, and I suppose our mission today, is to go beyond those headlines. It argues that despite the, well, strong surface numbers, there are significant underlying risks that demand a kind of strategic course correction.
Right. So consider this your shortcut to understanding what this crucial report really says. Not just the numbers, but what they actually mean. Let's try and figure out what's really going on with Ireland's money. Okay, so let's start with that bright picture the report paints initially. What are the key signs of strength? What's the good news here?
Well, the report is very clear. The labor market is exceptionally strong. I mean, employment is at an all-time high.
Yeah.
They specifically point out 85% of people aged 25 to 54 are in employment.
Wow, 85%.
Yeah, that's a record level for that group.
That's a really powerful indicator. And it's not just about having jobs, it's what those jobs pay, right? Is that improving?
Yes, finally. Wages are now, rising faster than prices. After that period when inflation really bit into purchasing power, this offers some relief to consumers.
Okay. And overall economic activity, the report uses GNI, which strips out some multinational distortions. How's that looking?
GNI grew by a solid 5% last year, and the report notes it's now comfortably above its pre-pandemic trend.
So the real domestic economy is performing well.
Yes, and what's fascinating here, actually, is that based on more real-time data like VAT receipts and card transactions, consumer spending might actually be even stronger, more buoyant than the official estimates capture.
Interesting. So there's definitely a lot of momentum there. But okay, even within this strength, the report points to vulnerabilities, pressures. What are the downsides it highlights?
Well, prices, they remain stubbornly high, particularly domestic ones. The report focuses on things like rent, restaurants, cafes, those sorts of costs.
So it's not just energy anymore.
No, exactly. With global energy prices having fallen, these domestic costs are now the main engine driving inflation.
This reminds me, there was a specific point in the report citing central bank research. It estimated that increases in government spending, specifically breaking the national spending rule, actually added to these price pressures.
Yes, that research suggested this spending pressure likely added about 1.9% to prices in 2025. And the report translates that to a potential cost for a typical household, maybe around €1,000 per year.
Wow, so that's the report drawing a direct line from fiscal policy decisions to, well, your pocket?
Pretty much. And while wages grew rapidly recently, 9.2% in 2023, 6% in the first half of 2024, the report is quick to point out that, look, a chunk of that growth was simply catch-up.
Catching up to the earlier inflation surge?
Exactly. Average real wages are above the pre-pandemic trend, which is good, but that recent pace isn't necessarily sustainable organic growth,
Got it. Any other pressures mentioned?
Yeah, another area highlighted is construction investment. The report notes a significant fall-off in office building, perhaps not surprising, but also continued difficulty in really ramping up home building at the scale needed.
Okay, so the economy's strong, but definitely with clear inflationary pressures, some domestic and sector-specific weaknesses like construction. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, the corporation tax receipts. The report calls them phenomenal. Blessing or curse?
Well, the report makes it unequivocally clear. These tax receipts are the reason Ireland is running a surplus. Full stop. We're talking about nearly €16 billion a year that the report identifies as excess or, windfall revenue.
16 billion a year extra?
And it's expected to hit 30 billion in 2024. And get this, a staggering 84 billion cumulatively just between 2026 and 2030.
84 billion? That number alone is just hard to get your head around.
It is. And the report underscores its importance by stating that without this excess corporation tax, Ireland would be running a deficit, about 6.3 billion in 2024 alone.
So the entire headline surplus is totally dependent on this one quite volatile source.
Yes. And what's particularly striking, and a major focus of the report's risk assessment, is the sheer concentration. It estimates that most of this massive windfall, this 16 billion plus a year, comes from just 3 companies.
3 companies, seriously.
Yes, in just 2 sectors, pharmaceuticals and tech.
Just 3 companies providing the bulk of that $16 billion? That sounds like, well, building your fiscal house on a very shaky foundation.
It is incredibly concentrated. And the report really highlights the fragility this creates. I mean, a significant hit to even 1 or 2 of these specific companies could dramatically reduce those receipts.
And presumably impact the high-paying jobs associated with them, too.
Absolutely. That's part of the risk profile.
And the report spells out the external risks, too, right? Things like U.S. policy changes.
Exactly. Since many of these are large U.S. multinationals, changes there matter hugely. Also, trade tensions or just a wider global recession, any of these could trigger a substantial drop.
Things largely outside Ireland's control.
Pretty much. Now, the report does note there might be some potential for future increases from technical things like ending certain tax allowances and the new global minimum effective tax rate, but it forcefully stresses that the overall risks around this revenue stream remain extremely high.
Okay. So we have this extraordinary but highly concentrated and risky income stream. If we do what the report urges and strip out that excess corporation tax to see the underlying picture, what does Ireland's fiscal situation actually look like then?
Yeah, the report is pretty stark here. If you look at the budget balance excluding those excess receipts, the headline surplus just vanishes. The public finances are actually in deficit on that basis.
An underlying deficit.
Yes, and the report forecasts they will remain in deficit right out to 2030 on this underlying basis.
That's such a crucial distinction the report wants you, the listener, to grasp, isn't it? Headline surplus versus underlying reality.
Absolutely critical. And the report also points to a related issue, a narrowing of the broader tax base.
How so?
Well, while corporation taxes become hyper-concentrated, broader taxes like the Universal Social Charge, the USC, have been cut or their base narrowed over time. The share of taxpayers contributing anything via income tax, or USC, has actually fallen. It was around 70%. Now it's down to 67%.
So roughly 1/3 of taxpayers are now exempt from contributing through either income tax or USC.
Yes. And the report adds, if the USC were abolished entirely, which is sometimes discussed, that share of contributors would drop even further to 62%, meaning well over 1/3 of taxpayers would be exempt from these broad income-based taxes.
Right, and the report brings this all together with a really striking historical comparison.
It does. It says that underlying revenue, so total revenue excluding that volatile excess corporation tax as a share of GNI, is at its lowest level since 1980.
Since 1980.
Think about that. The underlying tax base, the state's ability to fund itself from its regular domestic economy taxes, excluding this corporate windfall, is thinner now as a share of the real economy than it was during the, difficult fiscal crises of the 1980s.
That's a sobering thought. The report is essentially saying, without the volatile corporate tax, our core funding structure is historically weak.
That's the core message on the revenue side, yeah.
Okay. And speaking of funding the state, let's turn to spending. The report details a rapid increase there, too. How fast has it grown?
Very fast. Total government spending grew by 44% between 2019 and 2024.
44% in 5 years.
Yeah, that's an average of about 8% per year. Now, nominal national income, GNI, including price effects, actually grew slightly faster over that specific period. So spending as a share of GNI fell slightly, but it's basically back to where it was before the financial crisis. High levels.
What's interesting, though, is the report points out why it didn't rise even faster as a share of GNI. It wasn't necessarily restraint, was it?
No, not entirely. It highlights factors largely outside the government's direct control that help contain that ratio. Things like falling interest costs on the national debt and lower welfare costs simply because the jobs market has been so incredibly strong.
Right. So where has the government actively chosen to increase spending structurally? Which areas got the big increases?
The report clearly identifies health and public investment as the main drivers. Both of those areas grew by about 60% in cash terms between 2019 and 2024. Huge increases.
60%. But despite this significant jump in cash spending, the report suggests people might not feel a corresponding 60% improvement in services. Why that disconnect?
Well, a lot of that increased spending has basically been eaten up by higher prices for everything the public sector buys, goods, services, wages, and also simply the fact that the population has grown, so there are more people needing services.
So inflation and demographics absorb a lot of it.
Exactly. The report estimates that real spending per person, once you adjust for those price increases and population growth, increased by a much more modest 13% since 2019.
13%. Still an increase, but explains why it might not feel like a 60% jump on the ground.
Precisely. More money is being spent, but it's chasing higher costs and serving more people.
Okay. Now, the report really doesn't pull its punches when it comes to the government's own budgetary forecasts. It actually calls them not credible. That's strong language.
It is very strong language for an official assessment.
What are the specific issues that lead the report to such a, well, blunt conclusion?
One major problem it flags is unrealistic starting points for spending forecasts. So the budget for 2025 was based on an estimated spending overrun in 2024 of about $1.9 billion. But the report points out that the actual overruns in 2024 look closer to $3.8 billion.
So almost double.
Yeah. And that extra $1.9 billion of likely spending isn't actually budgeted for. It's not carried into the 2025 forecast numbers.
Hold on. So they're planning next year's budget based on spending significantly less this year than they are actually on track to spend.
That's exactly what the report implies. It immediately puts pressure on the planned budget for 2025 before the year even starts.
Okay, that seems problematic. What else?
The report also highlights major policy decisions being sort of left out of the core figures.
Yeah.
It points to a $3 billion increase in public investment for crucial areas like housing, water, the electricity grid, which is funded by selling off state-owned bank shares. But that $3 billion spend wasn't included in the main budgetary math presented.
A €3 billion spending plan omitted from the core figures. That's quite a chunk.
It really is. And then there are ongoing forecasting problems the report identifies. Things like unrealistic assumptions for how much the cost of supplies and services used by the public sector will grow. They call it intermediate consumption. The official forecast growth is 1% or less, whereas the recent average has been closer to 8.8% per year. Big difference.
A huge difference.
They also flagged some specific social contribution forecasts that seem to jump by nearly 20% without a clear explanation of why.
So, dodgy starting points, omitted spending, unrealistic cost assumptions. What does the report say is the net effect of all this?
Well, if more realistic assumptions were used, the report estimates the 2025 budget balance would actually look about $1.6 billion worse than officially forecast, and consequently, net debt would also be higher.
Okay. All of these points, the volatile income, the rapid spending, the shaky forecasts, they all seem to feed into the report's central, quite damning argument that policy has become de-anchored. What exactly does that phrase mean in this context?
It means that fiscal policy, government decisions on tax and spending, has drifted. It's sort of floated free from sustainable, prudent management. Largely because, as the report puts it, the government has been awash with resources, those unexpected corporate tax windfalls, which has fueled rapid spending increases.
And the report argues this is fundamentally the wrong approach when the economy is already running flat out, at full capacity.
Yes. The argument is you don't need more stimulus spending in that situation. In fact, adding more government demand just adds to those inflationary pressures we talked about earlier.
Right. It makes things more expensive for everyone.
Exactly. And crucially, this de-anchored approach widens the underlying problem, the structural deficit.
The deficit that exists without the temporary windfall taxes. And the report puts a number on that.
It does. It estimates that underlying structural deficit at around 3.5% of GNI for 2025.
3.5% of GNI. How much is that in euro terms?
That's over $10 billion.
Wow. So the report is saying that even setting aside the temporary corporate tax boom, Ireland is structurally set up to spend over $10 billion more than its underlying tax system brings in every single year.
That's the assessment. And the report adds that if you factor in those 2024 spending overruns properly carrying forward, that structural deficit could potentially be even higher, maybe 3.8% of GNI.
That really highlights the core underlying fiscal challenge facing the next government, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It's the central point about sustainability.
And the sheer pace of spending expansion seems key to this de-anchoring. The report uses a measure called net policy spending, adjusting for tax cuts, and shows really rapid increases, like over 8% in 2024 alone.
Yes, and the report argues this pace consistently exceeds the estimated sustainable growth rate for the underlying economy. It puts that sustainable rate somewhere between a conservative 0.5% and maybe 2.5% per year. So spending is growing much, much faster than the economy's underlying capacity.
Which means Ireland is consistently breaching its own domestic net spending rule.
Yes. That rule is designed to keep spending growth in line with that sustainable potential, but it's being exceeded.
Okay, which brings us neatly to the fiscal rules themselves, the constraints meant to prevent this. The report sees major cracks in these two.
It does. It argues the new EU rules are problematic for Ireland specifically, mainly because they focus heavily on GDP, which, as we know, is artificially inflated here due to multinational accounting practices.
Right, the leprechaun economics effect.
Exactly. And the EU rules also largely ignore the specific risks around Ireland's excess corporate tax receipts. So the report says this gives a misleading impression of lower debt and deficits than the underlying reality based on G&I and excluding windfalls actually suggests.
And if the headline numbers look good based on that inflated GDP, the preventive element of the EU rules is weaker, is that right?
Correct. If a country appears comfortably below the 60% debt to GDP ratio and the 3% deficit to GDP ratio, even if those figures are distorted, there's simply less external pressure from the EU framework to exercise prudence.
And isn't there even a discrepancy between the EU Commission's view and the Irish government's view on spending plans?
Yes, the report points that out. The European Commission itself estimates Ireland plans to breach its EU net spending growth limit in 2025. The Commission projects 6.6% growth, whereas the Department of Finance's own forecast used for the budget was 5.1%. So even the Commission thinks the plans are too expansionary under the EU rules.
Okay. And what about the domestic rule the report mentions, the one based on sustainable growth?
Well, as we said, it's been repeatedly breached. And for a long time, it didn't even have a proper legislative backing, though that's changed recently. Plus, the report notes that the medium-term objective underpinning that rule, aiming for a structural balance of -0.5% of GDP, has effectively been repealed anyway in recent policy documents.
So the target it was aiming for is gone.
Essentially, yes. The report's conclusion is pretty stark. Neither the new EU rules nor the current domestic rules provide a credible constraint for Ireland's specific situation, especially when you look at the true picture using G&I and excluding those windfall revenues. The rules just aren't biting effectively.
And the consequence of these weak constraints, a much looser policy stance compared to our European peers.
Exactly. The report's analysis shows Ireland's projected spending expansion from 2025 to 2028 is the second fastest among all EU countries, and potentially the fastest if you factor in those likely spending overruns and the other off-budget spending it identified. We're pushing the boat out more than most.
Okay. Looking beyond the immediate budget picture now, the report identifies some major, undeniable challenges coming down the track. Things that will put pressure on finances even with today's apparent surpluses. What are the big ones the report really focuses on?
Well, the foremost is definitely the aging population. Demographics. The report notes that the number of people aged 66 and over is set to almost double in the next 30 years, while at the same time, the working age population is forecast to largely stabilize, not grow much further.
That's a huge demographic shift, a near doubling of the older population. What does that mean for the ratio of workers to pensioners?
It means that ratio is projected to fall significantly. Right now, it's about 3.5 workers for every pensioner. By 2050, the report projects that could fall to around 2 workers for every pensioner.
2 to 1. That's a massive change in the dependency ratio.
It is. And this demographic crunch will inevitably place increasing pressure on public spending, particularly healthcare, long-term care, and of course, state pensions.
Now, the government has taken some steps, right? Like setting up the Future Ireland Fund to save some of the windfalls and planning gradual PRSI increases over time.
Yes, the report acknowledges those actions.
But it's clear these steps alone won't fully offset the projected costs of aging.
No, the report is quite clear they won't be sufficient on their own based on current projections. And it makes a really critical point about timing. Acting sooner on these long-term challenges is significantly less costly. It estimates that taking meaningful action now costs less than 40% of what it would cost if we delay significantly. Delaying makes an already expensive problem vastly more expensive down the line.
Procrastination is expensive when it comes to demographics.
Very much so.
Okay, so aging is challenge number 1. What's the second major challenge the report highlights?
Climate transition. And the report frames this interestingly, not just as needing government spending, but also posing a significant revenue challenge.
Also, revenue challenge.
Well, yes, managing the spending increases needed for climate action is part of it. The report estimates that might be around 0.6% of G&I, maybe $2 billion a year, which it sees as manageable. But potentially the bigger fiscal issue is replacing the tax revenues that will be lost as the economy greens, as people shift away from fossil fuels.
Ah, right. Like taxes on petrol, diesel, motor tax on polluting cars.
Exactly. Those revenues decline as we decarbonize. And the report estimates that if the tax system isn't reformed to find alternative revenue sources, that lost revenue could reach 1.6% of GNI per year. That's about $5 billion annually disappearing from the exchequer, a substantial gap to fill.
$5 billion a year in lost revenue. Okay. And then there's the other side of the climate coin, the potentially enormous cost of failing to meet our emissions reduction targets. The report uses pretty strong language here, I recall.
It does, and rightly so. If Ireland misses its legally binding climate targets for 2030, it could face massive compliance costs. Essentially, having to pay other countries potentially billions of euros to buy statistical transfers or carbon credits to make up for our own excess emissions.
Paying other countries because we didn't cut enough ourselves, how much could that cost?
The estimates vary widely depending on assumptions, but the report quotes ranges from 1.7 billion up to 9.6 billion by 2030. But, and this is a crucial warning it adds, that if the climate measures currently planned aren't fully implemented and effective, these compliance costs could escalate dramatically, potentially reaching as high as 20 billion.
20 billion euros in potential fines or payments by 2030.
That's the high-end risk scenario the report outlines if policies fail.
And the report calls that prospect a colossal waste.
It absolutely is. Imagine money that could be invested in Ireland's own infrastructure, healthcare, education, potentially being transferred abroad simply because national targets weren't met. A huge missed opportunity.
Okay, so aging, climate transition costs and revenues. What's the third major long-term challenge the report identifies?
Addressing Ireland's infrastructure deficits.
Right. Where does Ireland stand compared to, say, similar high-income European countries?
The report cites analysis showing Ireland lags significantly behind, about 20 to 25% behind the average of its peers in key infrastructure areas. Housing is the most obvious and acute deficit, but the report also mentions gaps in health infrastructure, transport networks, and energy systems.
And this links back to what you mentioned earlier about the construction sector, capacity issues there.
Yes, the report notes the construction sector is still dealing with the legacy of the financial crisis, when the workforce fell sharply. And its productivity also lags behind international peers, making it harder to deliver the volume needed efficiently.
But isn't Ireland already spending a lot on housing compared to other countries?
Interestingly, yes. The report finds that Ireland's government spending on housing as a percentage of GNI is already very high by European standards, actually the second highest.
Okay, so it's perhaps not just about the amount of money being spent, but maybe how effectively that spending translates into actual homes and infrastructure on the ground.
That seems to be a key implication.
No.
The report suggests solutions aren't just more money, but things like sustaining high investment levels over long term. Boosting construction sector productivity, for example, through modern methods of construction, and also streamlining planning and legal objection systems to speed up delivery.
Right, getting more bang for the buck, essentially.
Precisely.
Okay, so given this really complex picture surface strength masking underlying weakness, plus these major future pressures looming, what does the report conclude needs to happen? What's the strategic course correction it calls for?
Well, the core message, really, is that now, paradoxically, when the headline finances look strong because of the windfalls, is the critical window to plan seriously and structurally for the long term. The key is to avoid repeating Ireland's past boom-to-bust cycles, where temporary windfalls lead to permanent spending increases that can't be sustained.
Learn from history, basically. So what are the key concrete recommendations outlined?
First, the report calls for setting a credible, sustainable fiscal rule. It argues the next government absolutely needs binding limits, something like a properly designed net spending rule guided by a clear long-term debt target to help curb those expenditure pressures and reduce the dangerous dependence on volatile revenue.
So put proper guardrails in place. What's the second recommendation?
Realistic planning. The report specifically points to health spending as an area where, historically, budget ceilings have been set unrealistically low, and then the inevitable overruns are just accommodated year after year.
Which undermines the whole budget process.
Exactly. So it recommends a comprehensive review of health spending drivers and then setting realistic multi-annual ceilings, alongside more robust, transparent, long-term planning for those big challenges. housing, and climate action.
Okay, rules and realistic planning. What's the third key recommendation? It's about the corporation tax windfalls, right?
Yes, and this is perhaps the most fundamental, maybe even controversial one. The report strongly recommends fundamentally rethinking how Ireland treats these excess corporation tax receipts. It explicitly suggests treating them like Norway treats its oil revenue as a high-risk, likely finite national resource that should not be built into funding day-to-day government spending.
Or treat it like oil money. And the report highlights the stark difference in approach right now between Norway and Ireland.
A major difference. Norway saves basically all of its risky resource revenues in its sovereign wealth fund and only allows the government to spend the estimated long-term investment returns from that fund. Very prudent.
And Ireland.
Ireland, according to the report's analysis of current government plans, like the Future Ireland Fund, intends to save just over one-third, about 36% of its risky corporate tax windfalls over the coming years. The rest is implicitly being used to fund spending or tax cuts.
So Norway saves 100%, Ireland plans to save about 36%. Big gap.
Huge gap in approach to managing volatile resource wealth.
And the report explicitly raises the risk of Dutch disease in this context, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It defines Dutch disease clearly. That's the economic phenomenon, where heavy reliance on a single, booming, often volatile sector, like resources, or in our case, multinational corporation tax, drives up domestic costs and wages across the board, which inadvertently makes other exporting sectors of the economy less competitive internationally. Their costs go up, but their prices are set globally.
So the boom in one area potentially harms other parts of the economy.
Exactly. And the report explicitly states that Ireland's current situation meets the criteria for being at risk of this resource curse driven by this volatile tax stream.
So to protect against that Dutch disease risk, what does the report suggest?
Well, aligned with the Norway comparison, it suggests saving much more of the risky receipts, but also actively using policy to diversify the economy and focusing investments specifically on things that boost long-run productivity and competitiveness across all sectors of the economy, not just relying on the current high-paying multinational sectors.
Building broader resilience.
That's the idea.
Okay. And finally, the report also identifies some broader shortcomings in Ireland's overall fiscal framework, the whole system of budgeting and rules.
Yes. Briefly, it notes that the official forecasts, while looking medium-term, are often unrealistic, especially on the spending side, as we discussed. It argues there's currently no credible anchor. The fiscal rules aren't working effectively to prevent runaway spending or tax cuts based on these temporary volatile windfalls.
And transparency issues, too.
Yes, a significant lack of transparency is flagged. Things like the independent costing of new policy measures before they're announced, proper publication of non-exchequer forecasts that affect the budget, and clear reporting on whether the government is actually adhering to its own supposed fiscal rules.
The report even includes kind of checklist assessment of Ireland's fiscal framework against international best practice, doesn't it? How did Ireland score?
Not well. It found Ireland's framework met only 2 out of 8 key criteria for best practice. That's a pretty low score.
2 out of 8. Ouch.
It really underscores the report's core argument that the current framework isn't really fit for purpose in managing this unique, complex, and risky fiscal situation Ireland finds itself in.
Okay, so bringing this all together then, for you, the listener, what's the absolute core message to take away from this deep dive into the Fiscal Assessment Report?
I think the report clearly shows that while Ireland benefits enormously right now from high employment and tax windfalls, the underlying fiscal picture, once you strip out that temporary boom, is actually weaker than it looks. And crucially, there are major structural risks baked into the current situation, alongside significant, expensive future challenges aging, climate that aren't being adequately planned or budgeted for yet.
Yeah, the main risks highlighted seem crystal clear. An unhealthy over-reliance on a highly concentrated and unpredictable tax source from just a few companies. Rapid spending increases that aren't really constrained by effective rules or realistic forecasts. And these massive long-term costs looming from demographics and climate change that require urgent strategic action, not just hoping the windfalls last forever.
Exactly. Understanding this report, understanding these nuances is really key, I think, to cutting through the political noise around budget time. It helps you distinguish between the impressive but potentially fragile headline numbers and the underlying fiscal reality that will ultimately shape future taxes and public services for everyone.
It really makes you consider how much of the current fiscal comfort, the apparent room for maneuver, is built on a foundation that could potentially shift quite dramatically and maybe quite quickly.
Absolutely. And if we take that report's idea seriously
Yeah.
about treating the excess corporation tax like Norway treats its oil and connect it to that potential risk of Dutch disease.
It really does raise a provocative final thought for you to consider. Could relying so heavily on this unpredictable tech and pharma tax bounty actually end up harming the rest of the Irish economy in the long run? By driving up costs, squeezing out other businesses, making us less competitive overall? What would a truly strategic long-term approach to managing these unprecedented resources really look like for Ireland? Something to mull over.